So, Ash, the Game Awards as of today are 1 week away. And there's been a lot of discussion about the indie category. Because let me just read out the nominations for Best Indie this year. So, we've got Cocoon, Dredge, Sea of Stars, Viewfinder, and then Dave the Diver. And Dave the Diver is what's causing a lot of controversy because it's made by one of the biggest game developers in Korea. They've made a lot of Korean-specific games. They published the Korean version of Final Fantasy XIV. They've done stuff like MapleStory and a lot of big games. They're not an indie developer, is the general point. And that's caused quite a stir. I've heard some from some indie developer friends of mine who are quite upset that this is taking the place of other indie games that could have deserved that spot this year. So clearly it's not resonating with everyone. And Jeff Keighley went on a Q&A, and this was reported by VGC, who have basically just taken down every note he said. And this was what he said to them when asked why Dave the Diver is in the indie category. He said, "Look, it's a great question. Independent can mean different things to different people. It's sort of a broad term. You can argue, does independent mean budget of the game? Does independent mean financing? Does it mean the team size? Is it just the spirit of the game, meaning smaller game?" That's his statement on that. What's your take on this whole indie being a broad term and Dave the Diver being nominated for Best Indie?
I think it's all to use a British term, bollocks. I think it's all bollocks, John. I think it's ridiculous, and I am offended for indie devs out there. Look, there's also on the article we're looking at, which is the VGC article about this whole debacle. There's Aaron Cini on Twitter saying, "I understood both sides of the argument, but I do feel the term best indie game is more of a look and feel these days than a semantic over a definition." And I think that is ridiculous. All respect to Mr. Cini, I'm not talking crap or anything, but that is so disrespectful to all the indie developers out there for whom the struggle is real. The whole point of an indie game is they're not working with the same resources as a AAA or even a middleware like AA developer. They struggle in a different way to create the games that we play. And to say that indie just is a look and a feel, that applies to any, I guess, 2D pixel art game, regardless of budget, I think it undermines the whole concept of being an indie game, right? Am I crazy or
No, absolutely. Especially in recent years, just pinning down what indie feel means, it's kind of meaningless. Because it's not just pixel art games. That would be silly to say that. Some indies are if you just look at the Switch's launch, one of the best looking launch titles was Fast Racing Neo, or Fast RMX even. And that's an indie game made by just a few people in Germany. And that's what we're seeing all the time. We're seeing a lot of indies pushing boundaries. A lot of the big 3D platformer revival is being done by indies. It's not just pixel art. So to give a huge Korean company who have made a lo-fi game the category of indie does feel ridiculous. As for indie being a broad term, let's just try and define indie a moment. What would you say is the definition of an indie game or an indie developer?
To me, it comes down to and I don't have hard numbers here, but to me it comes down to the size of the studio, the size of the budget, the resources one is using when making a game. By definition, a game, I mean, what's even the point of having something called an indie game if anything can be one? If for that matter, why isn't The Last of Us an indie game? If anything can be an indie game, what's even an indie game? So to me, it has to do with the size, the resources one is using to make a game, the size of the studio, the size of the team, the size of the budget. That to me is what separates an indie game, regardless of quality, from your AAA games that have hundreds of millions of dollars in budget, right?
I like that definition because oftentimes you hear games with a publisher, and that's a bit outdated now because you've got publishers publishing indie games. Like we've got Platonic and Friends, we've got Devolver. There's quite a few publishers out there. Limited Run are publishing some indie games now. So that isn't quite right. But that said, they still are not providing the same resources that you would get from a AAA developer. Square has their indie initiative where Square Enix publishes indie games. Does that mean they're indie? And I think given the resources they allow them, they are not giving them the big budgets of like Final Fantasy or anything. It's definitely still very, small. So I think they would still count as indie. But then you've got things like Snipperclips, right? That was done by just 2 people, but it was published by Nintendo.
Right.
So with that, I think SFB Games, the developers of Snipperclips, definitely are indie. They're not owned by anyone. They're just 2 guys. But Snipperclips, the IP, not indie. That's a Nintendo IP.
Right.
That's the way I see it, at least.
Well, and then, of course, the definition becomes further muddled when you consider something like Shantae, right? Shantae comes from WayForward, and WayForward is arguably a big enough company that it's hard to consider them indie, even though Shantae is regularly considered indie, right? But WayForward is a fairly large company. It's certainly bigger than most indie developers. So the definition does become a little bit further muddled when you consider things like that. And so it's definitely, there's no hard cutoff, right? There's no hard definition, but I think the at least the extreme, in my opinion, argument that indie just constitutes a look and a feel, but can come from a studio of any size is absolutely ridiculous.
Right. Like, if Nintendo were to make a pixel art Zelda game again, and it got nominated for Best Indie, I wouldn't know what to think of that.
Same.
Yeah, like Nintendo did collaborate with for Cadence of Hyrule, which was technically, I think it's published by Spike Chunsoft rather than Nintendo. But I think it'd be odd to call that an indie game. I think the developer behind that, yes, indie, but it's Zelda. At that point, it's no longer an actual indie game. There's definitely a cutoff between independent developer and independent property. Like Sonic Mania, if that were also nominated for Best Indie, I think that would be undermining a lot of other indies that made games that year. But, of course, the team behind it, the people making it, are independent. There's no real arguing about that.
I don't know. I don't even see why this whole thing had to become an issue. Like, we never really needed to question I don't think there's ever any reason to question the definition of an indie game. Yet here we are with Dave the Diver. And no, nothing against Dave the Diver. I haven't played it. I'm sure it's great. But I just feel like it completely takes the piss out of the struggle that so many indie devs go through to create what they want to create with limited resources. I just think that's so disrespectful, in my opinion.
It is. It definitely is. And I don't think it's even a Jeff thing, because like in this record of what he said, he goes on to say, I think everyone has a different opinion about it, and we really defer to our jury of 120 global media outlets who vote on these awards. So I don't think Jeff chose Dave the Diver. I think the media outlets voted for it.
No.
Which is more of a systematic thing, if anything, that everyone across this industry, like the majority, view Dave the Diver as an indie game. I think that's the biggest problem, is the perception of what makes indie. Because clearly it's, for people who live and breathe games and work in games media, if they view it as an indie game, I think we've got a big problem there. It just feels like a slap in the face to a lot of people who make these games, and a misunderstanding of what games even are, to some extent.
I agree, and where does, it's a slippery slope. Where does the buck stop, right? Like if a game like Dave the Diver is considered indie, then next year, 2 years, 3 years from now, what's going to stop somebody, like from what you said, if Nintendo or Square or Capcom were to make an indie-style game, and I use the biggest air quotes possible when I say that, if some giant publisher were to make an indie-style game, what's stopping the industry, for the powers that be, from nominating one of those games?
Right, like
for Best Indie Game.
Capcom do make low-budget, lo-fi games sometimes.
Right.
Like Mega Man 9 and 10 they fit that category. There's Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection. Some of these big developers are still making, the sprite-based games, 2D games, which obviously aren't lesser in any capacity, but by these merits, if Dave the Diver's there, then maybe they should count too. It is a slippery slope. I think there's been a big mistake here, all in all. And it definitely feels like damage control to call it a broad term, because it quite clearly is not. It is not a broad term.
I remember back in 2010, and I definitely had to look that up because I didn't remember this specifically, but I was thinking of a Capcom game back from 2010 called Dark Void Zero, which was intentionally retro style, kind of like Mega Man 9, but unlike Mega Man, Dark Void is not a known IP. It was like a kind of an original project, but it was intentionally retro styled. And I feel like if we were in 2010 right now, and we were looking at the Game Awards nominees for Best Indie Games, there's no reason that something that looks like Dark Void Zero wouldn't be nominated if it was really, really good. And it shouldn't be. Capcom made it. Like, that's what we're looking at here. Yeah.
And there's two different award categories as well for indie games. There's Best Debut and Best Indie Game. Pizza Tower made it into Best Debut, but it did not make it into Best Indie. And that is something a lot of people are upset about as well. And I think that's also a confusing category, like to, split up debut and a release game. Like, it kind of feels like almost like a participation medal. Like, well done for releasing, but you're not quite good enough to get the whole actual award, which is also nonsense because Pizza Tower is incredible, and I think that probably should have taken the place of Dave the Diver.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't know. I hope that this is a trend that does not continue. I mean, clearly there's been enough of a kerfuffle about it that people are taking notice. I mean, we're doing a video on it. We've seen other, discussions out there about it. To what extent they'll matter and move the needle, I don't know. But I just feel like that the indie space really, by definition, needs to be protected for and defined for what it is, so that the giant publishers don't encroach on that space, because it's just not the same. It's not the same experience trying to make a game on a super limited budget with a super small team as it is with hundreds of millions of dollars and hundreds of people on a development team. It's both experiences are difficult, because video game development is difficult no matter what. I'm not saying one's easy and one's not. They're both difficult, but in different ways. And I feel like that dichotomy needs to be protected.
I've had my problems with Nintendo in the past too. In their indie worlds, they featured Tetris Effect once. And Enhance is maybe an indie studio. Like, if Luminous were to show up with like a brand new game being self-published, sure. But it's Tetris, It doesn't feel fair to have like an indie who's just, scraping by, making their dream game from the ground up with their own IP, and then they're followed up by Tetris. Like, that doesn't feel fair in any regard. We had like No More Heroes before as well. Maybe Suda's company counts as I don't even know at that point. But yeah, there's definitely a different limit there. And it's not just the Game Awards. I think it's an industry-wide problem. But hopefully, this is just talking about it brings attention to it. Indie, it's not a hard thing to define, but it's a easy thing to protect. I feel like if you just allow those who are self-funding, self-publishing, or even just working within a small team and budget to flourish, then we don't need to be taking their recognition away by like multi-billion-dollar companies like Nexon, who are doing Dave the Diver.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I feel like we're just this side of like a game like Sonic Mania now being considered indie, and it's like, okay, no, we gotta draw the line somewhere here, and it's way before Sonic Mania, of course. But yeah, I agree with you, man. I really hope that we are that we, a collective we, not we specifically, but a collective we, are able to move the needle on this conversation, because the indie space needs to be protected and separated for what it is, and not just overwhelmed by AAA developers with their giant budgets.
Yeah. I think we've said just about everything there is to say at this point.
I think so.
I have one last question, Ash. Do you think Jeff Keighley will bring any attention to the layoffs of 2023? Or is it just going to be, like, what a year for games?
I doubt it. I don't see it happening. I mean, especially given how much of the Game Awards' airtime is already occupied with kind of nonsense. I kind of don't see him doing that. I hope he does, but I kind of think it's going to be more about a night of celebrating games, the game industry, not world premieres, since they're not using those title cards anymore, but they're still doing them, allegedly. Yeah, I don't think he's going to pay lip service to that, but I hope he does. What about you?
No, I think he wants to be friends with all these publishers, and he don't want to throw any under the bus. Like they did with Konami when it came to Kojima, but I think at that point Konami was already pretty far gone that it was no damage to the Game Awards. But yeah, I don't expect it. But either way, hopefully in the future there's more care put into this indie category, and hopefully more people get recognized. It's a very small amount. Like if you look at all the nominations this year, I mean, it's been a crazy year for games, but if you go through like best visuals, best soundtrack, you're not finding indie games in there. It's
No.
just the top tier. Indies just get their own little category, and that's it. And even that's being encroached upon by big games.
Which that is right. I also hate that separation that somehow, and it isn't always true. We did see It Takes Two win a couple
Yeah.
years ago, which was nice, was refreshing. But I do hate that in general, indie games seem to not be able to break into the quote unquote real categories, the big boy categories, right? Which is absurd.
I'll never forgive. Like they nominated Celeste in its year, which is great, but
Right.
it lost to Red Dead Redemption 2.
Yeah.
You
no.
kidding me? I don't
No.
think Tetris Effect was even nominated that year for best soundtrack,
Which
which
is-
is also a crime.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
we'll wrap
This-
this up now. So thank you for listening, everyone. Let us know your thoughts on what you think an indie is. Like, is our definition just off from what you think it is, or do you have more to contribute? Let us know in the comments, and we will catch you all next time. And if you want to, you can also support us on patreon.com/GV Gaming, where you can also contribute to the GVG cast, see videos early, and a bunch more. So thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.
Bye.